Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next science lecture on cybersecurity in the maritime sector. I'm having a bit of trouble with my microphone, so my audio is coming from Emma's here, but I hope that's not too confusing. And you're not here to listen to me either. You're here to listen to our wonderful guest lecturer, who is Barend Pretorius, who's with us today. Dr. Barend Pretorius holds a PhD in the cybersecurity of the industrial Internet of Things, a master's degree in information systems, and a Bachelor of Science honors in mathematical statistics. A certified information security manager with over 18 years of experience, Dr. Pretorius joined Transnet Group in 2014 as a senior information security analyst and has since advanced through various roles. He currently serves as the executive manager, information security and governance at Transnet Group, where he is responsible for establishing and maintaining an enterprise-wide information security program and strategy, including an information security management system, ICT governance, risk, and compliance. And with that brief introduction out of the way, I'm now going to hand it over to Barend to take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elton, for the nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this lecture. I hope you're ready to get wet and swim in the ocean with the maritime cybersecurity. Let me see if I can share my screen. And yeah, let's start. So first, we're just going to do some introductions to the maritime cybersecurity. I'm going to talk about some of the objectives of the session. So the session aims to introduce the significance of cybersecurity in the maritime sector. You'll learn why it's important, what are the key challenges, some of the evolving threats, some of the incidents, and some cybersecurity strategies to help protect yourself if you're an organization in the sector. Why is it important? So the importance of the maritime is basically because it's essential for global trade. Therefore, it became a critical target for cyber criminals, hackers, activists, and so on. Also, the increased digitization of the sector. If you think about, example, container tracking, Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, this basically increased the attack surface and introduced more vulnerabilities. All this could lead to financial losses should any of these systems be compromised, but not only just financial losses, there's also a disruption in the entire supply chain, and there's also a safety risk that's quite important. We can see the effect of, example, sanctions and tariffs that's maybe imposed by certain countries. Now imagine if there's no trade, if there's no food. There was called a perfect storm after the cyber attack in 2021 in South Africa when Transnet was hit. They called it a perfect storm because it said it could lead to food shortages and it could disrupt the entire economy if the systems weren't recovered in time. The rise of sophisticated cyber attacks, example ransomware, as well as state-sponsored attacks, made this industry a very lucrative industry for attackers. There's been a 400% increase since 2012 of attacks in this sector. This is due to a lot of things. One of them is, example, the vulnerabilities and legacy in unpatched OT or operational technology systems, as well as the increased use of digital communication. Next, we're going to look at some of the unique challenges in this sector and what sets this apart from other sectors. So first off is the harsh operational environment. Ships are at sea in severe weather condition, so there's sometimes a lot of corrosion that could lead to complications in some of the equipment. A lot of the ships is in remote areas, which require specialized communication, satellite comms, and so on to communicate. The corrosion in these harsh conditions could deteriorate the critical systems, which could lead to increased vulnerabilities. One of the other things is physical access. In a perfect environment, you would have a server room that is protected by access controls. It might be monitored 24/7. There's biometric access, there's air conditioning, raised floors, all those things, perfect conditions for your equipment to reside in. However, for the maritime sector, whether it's in a port, whether it's in a ship, the equipment doesn't reside in those ambient conditions. It resides in harsh conditions, which is subject to the nature. And as mentioned, it could lead to corrosiveness and so on. One of the biggest things that sets this apart is the complex supply chain. So the maritime sector relies on intricate global supply chains, and there's various dependencies. If you think of, example, a manufacturer, whether it's a car manufacturer, they only maybe have 1 or 2 dependencies, or 3 or 4. However, if you look at the supply chain, it's quite a lot of dependencies, and one disruption in this link can have a ripple effect on the entire chain. So if you think about, example, somebody would have to produce the goods, whether it's food coming from agriculture, farmers, or whether it's equipment being manufactured. Those equipment or food, the goods needs to be then transported via either rail or truck to the ports. That needs to then be onboarded onto a vessel, and that vessel needs to then discharge the cargo at the relevant destination. From there, it will be discharged onto either a truck or a train. It will go into a warehouse, and then it will go to the end consumer. That's just the one way. Then also have to just follow the other way as well, where things have to come from the example consumers. If you want to example export things, people want to import goods. So it's a whole entire supply chain that's dependent on the maritime sector, and disruptions would not only have impact on the cargo flow, but also the safety and the economic stability. There's also a lot of connectivity requirements in the sector. As mentioned, that your vessels and equipment are housed in different areas. Example, a vessel at sea might not connect through your normal Wi-Fi like we have at home. It will need specialized satellite connections or similar to connect to the outside world. There's also increased containers tracking, such as reefer monitoring, where advanced technologies such as IoT or industrial Internet of Things are used to track containers. They're also, example, used to monitor the temperature inside containers to make sure that your produce doesn't go off. Because of that, all these devices needs connectivity. And because of that increased in connectivity, it creates a very complex environment. And that complex environment also makes it more vulnerable and lucrative for attackers. There's also a blur line between IT, which is your information technology, as well as your OT, operational technology. And that makes it very difficult to secure, as there are various different risks in each of those areas. One of the other aspects is around regulations. Now, in 2017, the IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization, released a directive, MSC 42898, which basically requires all shipping companies to take proactive approaches to cybersecurity. They are required to conduct regular cyber risk assessments as well as audits. This directive also encouraged collaboration between ship operators, classification societies, ports authorities on cybersecurity best practices, and making sure that this industry is secured. This directive is critical for the maritime, as it mandates them to be resilient against cyber attacks and threats. Next, we're going to look at some of the key stakeholders. Key stakeholders in the maritime sector, as I mentioned, is quite a vast majority of role players. It could start from the agriculture, where you have your citrus farmers, example, or your normal agriculture. It could be even manufacturers. Then there's warehousing, as mentioned. You have your trucking, your transport, your rail operators, your port operators, your shipping lines, your vessel agents, your regulators, as well as your technology providers. So there's quite a lot of role players in this maritime sector, which makes it very complex as well. And as mentioned, if one is affected, it will have a ripple effect on the rest. So all of these stakeholders play a very crucial role in the sector, and the collaboration amongst them is essential to ensure that we protect the organization and the sector as best we can. Next, we will look a bit at IT and OT and some of the differences between the two. So IT, or information technology, is basically your normal enterprise technology that everyone is used to. That's your work networks, your enterprise networks, where you can receive your email, your financial systems, etc. They're normally used to manage your data, your information. These systems prioritize confidentiality, and then its integrity, and then availability. However, with your OT, or your operational technology systems, it's the other way around. Availability is prioritized, then integrity, and then confidentiality. Just to think of it, so if you example at work and the HR system is unavailable for 4 hours, and you can't, that might be a disruption for you, that you can't maybe process your leave or check your leave balances, but it is not as critical as a operational technology, example, a crane or a ship's managing system being unavailable. That would be disastrous, even if it's for an hour or so. So that's the importance that these two, the CIA, or the CIA triad, as we mentioned, normally call it, is basically other way around for operational technology. And as mentioned, in the maritime sector, it makes use of both of these, IT and OT. And that's one of the things that adds to the complexity of this environment. So the OT is normally referred to as your physical control systems. In some instances, it's the systems that can control the crane, although some cranes are manually operated. The computers behind the manual operations, behind the joysticks. Some is automated. There's some ports in the world that's completely automated, where there's no human intervention. And that's all controlled by this OT, operational technology systems. We'll just go into a bit of details of the use of these systems in the maritime. So for IT, as mentioned, it's normally your office networks, where you can do your administration, your finances, your HR, human resources, your supply chain, etc. One of the other things is your terminal operating system, or a TOS. This is a system that basically controls the terminal layout, your planning of your yards, planning of your vessels. In some cases, some people might define or classify it as OT, but in a sense that majority of the cases, it falls under IT. There are integration points of your terminal operating system into the OT environment. Example, where it provides instructions to a straddle carrier to fetch a container, or it could provide information to an operator or truck to where to collect the container from the yard. So there's some integration and touch points between the IT and OT. Then there's also some maintenance, spares, permits, That's controlled via your IT systems, entrance to the ports, etc. And that's all quite critical in terms of physical safety. Your EDI or electronic data interfaces is quite critical. That's also, as mentioned, there's a lot of role plays in the area that needs to send information. So example, if a shipping line needs to book a container or a cargo, they'll need to send an EDI message through to the port operator as an example. The port operator would then receive that instruction. It could also be coming from the trucking fraternity or the train, whichever. And it's quite important that the systems interface with each other and making sure that's all secure. So one of the older methods of connecting was FTP, which we know is all very old and outdated, insecure, but you'd be surprised how many people still use FTP, which still passes passwords in clear text. Obviously, the better way is looking at SFTP or OFTP or FTPS, one of those, and probably one where you use certificates like SFTP. The OT, the operational technology in the maritime, there's quite a lot of uses for that as well. One is around your SCADA, and SCADA, for those that don't know, stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. So basically, it's got two parts. Supervisory control. Basically, would be somebody sitting behind a screen, watching the machinery, and they would have control, whether it's via a joystick or a computer to control machinery. So that's a supervisory control. And then the data acquisition, but basically you would have a lot of sensors in your equipment that would feed back to the operators. Example, alarm bells, if the motors would overheat or going too fast. It could be example even in a sense where there's conveyor belts, where the conveyor belts has got scales in to measure the weights of the cargo. Those would all feed back as part of a data acquisition to the operators. Then also something called PLCs, for those that's familiar with that, programmable logical controllers. That's basically the heart of the SCADA or the industrial control systems. These basically is the PCs or the computers behind, if I can put it that, the brains controlling a lot of these systems. And a lot of these have been built without cybersecurity in mind. And I think that's where a lot of the challenges comes into. You would also need some remote support for the engineers that would need to connect to the equipment. And as an example, most of the cars these days, they come already with a SIM card. And I actually got an alert the other day on my car to say, okay, it's almost due for service. The oil life is X%, and so on. So it comes with all these very smart technologies, which is driven by IoT or Industrial Internet of Things. And especially for equipment as well, used in the ports. If you look at cranes, those cranes are a couple million of rands or dollars, and it needs to be monitored, making sure that there's proactive maintenance in place, and all those sensors requires connectivity. Then there's also data loggers, as mentioned. The data sensors would provide data back to the control center so that they can see what's happening in the yard, in the equipment, in the ship. And they can normally would have predictive analytics or some sort of algorithms that they can use the data for. Also, the engine and cargo control is controlled by the operational technology. And then there's also the GPS, AIS, and dynamic positioning systems, which are basically used to pinpoint the ship's location or the vessel's location. There's also cranes, mooring systems, yeah, you name it. So there's quite a lot of uses for OT in the maritime environment. So the question is, how does a vessel look like from a hacker's perspective? And this is quite a nice picture that I've seen from the pentestpartners.com. basically showing a connected ship with all the different areas. So, for example, start right on top around physical security, as mentioned, like your server rooms, they don't have that same control as a server room in a IT environment. You would have different equipment residing in there. There's different ways to access those. Social engineering, normal access control, etc. And as mentioned as well, the harsh conditions that these vessels reside in might form corrosion, and some might not even be able to be locked. As mentioned, remote access is there. So there's quite a lot of things: navigation, your satellites, your GPS, AIS, and these just show some of the attacks that's possible, and we'll maybe discuss some of them during the incidents, like GPS spoofing. Then there's also just a normal ship network where you've got your, basically from the IT side, your emails, your stores, your crew timing, all those things. And yeah, it could be attacked via either phishing emails, malicious USBs, etc. One of the other things is the loading and stability. Your bay planning software, as mentioned, your TOS, your terminal operating system, is used to plan the vessel. It will be used to plan, to say, example, which containers need to come off first of the vessel, depending on which different port is going to dock at. But also importantly is around the weight distribution. You don't want containers that's heavy all just on one side of the ship, because it could create an imbalance on the ship. And there was some talks of some hackers that actually, with some oil rigs, that actually managed to sink them because of the instability and how it was loaded. Then, yeah, industrial control system, as mentioned, your SCADAs, your PLCs, and so on. Your crew network, where your crew actually need to connect to. They normally would have Wi-Fi or wired networks. They would have their own, bring your own device, etc. And all those just basically opens up this to attackers, if not adequately secured. Yeah, then also the comms, as mentioned, from your email right through to even your ship radio. So your radios could be jammed. There could be, yeah, interception of communications. The GPS spoofing we'll get to just now when we discuss some of the incidents. So it just shows all the different attack surfaces that is opened up in a ship. Next, we'll look at some of the major cyber security incidents that has taken place in the maritime. So the maritime sector has come under attack in the last 4 or 5 years because of its lucrativeness, because of the global trade, as well as the potential to disrupt the industry. It has been a prime target for attackers. 4 of the major shipping companies have fallen a victim to cyber attacks. Those include Maersk, CMA, CGM, as well as MSC and Costco Shipping. A lot of the media report says that this is directly linked to the adoption of new technology, such as your container tracking, your IoT, etc. And as mentioned, this new technology comes with new connectivity. For IoT devices specifically, there's also new networks like your Sigfox, low frequency networks that can span quite a lot, quite far distances, and if not adequately secured, could be used as a target. Now let's look at some of the notable incidents, and I haven't looked at all of them. There's quite a lot of them, but I've just maybe looked at five of the incidents. As mentioned, there was also some oil rigs that were affected by cyber attacks which had malware that disrupted the navigation systems, and it actually resulted the oil rigs to drift off position, as well as the hackers being able to tilt oil rigs in 2014. But the first one is the port of Antwerp, and I think this is one of the ones that comes to mind of one of the probably the first attacks on the Maritime, where hackers basically infiltrated the network in the port, and they basically located specific containers, and they made off with their other smuggled drugs, and then they deleted the records, so there was no record of them coming into the port. And this is probably one of them, the incidents that's talked about quite often and the most. And yeah, this is probably one of the incidents that trickled my interest in this sector as well. In 2017, Maersk got hit by the NotPetya ransomware, and I think this is something that was probably one of the biggest first ransomware attacks that was out there, and probably just because it caused such a big disruption. They lost quite a lot of data. They lost about 300 million losses and downtime. They had to rebuild how many systems. So it caused quite a significant impact in that sector. And I think it was also one of the first where it was so big and nobody kind of expected it. And yeah, that was back in 2017. Just a year later, Costco also had a ransomware incident, which disrupted their operations. And it just basically illustrates the risks in this logistics chain that we need to take care of. And as we know, ransomware is quite a tricky subject, especially if you haven't done proper backups, because yeah, once they hit you, it's quite a mess. And then an interesting one is in 2019, the port of Shanghai. They experienced a spoofing of both their GPS or global positioning system, as well as their automatic identification system or AIS. Basically, the attackers use this to hide the location of vessels, and they suspect that these vessels were involved in illegal, unreported or unregulated fishing. Or the speculations also that it might have been to hide the Iranian oil shipments. So what they basically do with this GPS and AIS spoofing is, where if you think the vessel is on coordinates XY, it's actually in different coordinates AB. But because of that, it paints a completely different picture of which vessels are where, and you can actually hide some vessels. And then the importance of this as well with new technology, making sure that it doesn't get interrupted or disrupted. There is also apps now. You can basically go into the internet or in apps on your phone, and you can locate any vessel. We normally sometimes see a big vessel then at sea, and then you just find an app and say, okay, cool, this is a shipping container, or this is a oil rig. When my previous place where we stayed, we had a nice view of the ocean, and we saw a vessel, quite a big vessel, quite close to the shore, and was wondering what it is doing here. And then when I checked on that app, it basically showed it was one of those vessels from Seacom that was laying the underground fiber cables, which is quite interesting. You can pick that up. There is some hackers that now have used this together with Shodan to actually try to locate vessels in real time, and then showed the vulnerabilities in real time of those vessels. So yeah, it becomes quite scary the more we get connected. And then 2021, close to my heart, where Transnet experienced a ransomware attack, which disrupted most of South Africa, as Transnet basically manages all the ports in South Africa. All those ports came to a standstill due to the ransomware attack. And yeah, I think it was resolved within a week. They were back up and running. However, the post-recovery caused significant delays. There was a lot of claims against Transnet as well. There was spoiled food. And you can think about that as well, that the shelf life of food, even if it's refrigerated, is maybe 7 to 7 days. Now, that food needs to be in a supermarket, in example, Europe. Now, if there's any delays, that food, once it reached that destination, is already spoiled, and then the manufacturer or the farmer would lose the revenue because of that. So you can imagine the impact it had. One of the reporters called it the perfect storm, because it said it could actually, if it didn't recover within a week or so, it could have actually resulted in food shortages and, yeah, even worse. What do we learn from these attacks? Is basically that there's a couple of attack vectors in the maritime. The first one being ransomware, and it remains the most prevalent threat. As we know what ransomware does, I'm not going to go into the details, but basically it encrypts your files and it demands some sort of payment. There's also talks that some people actually pay them, and then they provide the, so to say, key for unencrypting or decrypting the files. However, sometimes it just helps the attackers to get a bigger foothold or a lock into your organization. So yeah, it's quite a big one, ransomware. If you don't have the adequate controls in place, if you fall victim to that, it's quite significant. The other biggest one, and I think it's something that's not just unique to the maritime, it's probably the number one attack vector for most companies, is around phishing attacks. And that's how a lot of people get a foothold into the door of a company. So it is something, but I didn't mention it specifically for the maritime, as I just wanted to look at maybe unique ones to the maritime sector. GPS spoofing and AIS manipulation, as mentioned, can mislead navigation systems. It could lead to unsafe maritime operations. It could endanger the cargo as well as the crew safety. Think about the Titanic that hit an iceberg back in, sure, was in the early 1900s. If a hacker is able to mess with your navigation system, you can basically direct or guide a ship into another iceberg, or yeah, somewhere. So it's good. It's quite critical that these systems get secured, and people don't lose their lives because of lack of cybersecurity controls. So one of the reasons we look at the incidents is to look at what we can learn from these attacks. And they say the best way to learn is from your mistakes, but you can't make all the mistakes. So you sometimes got to learn from other people's mistakes as well. And we have the incidents that's out there, and other organizations can learn from that. Unfortunately, if you're the first one that experienced it, then yeah, that's unfortunately the bad luck. But yeah, you can learn from others' mistakes. So the first one is around the increasing frequency of cyber attacks. Maybe 15 years ago, you might have heard of 1 or 2 cyber attacks a month or so. Now it's almost daily there's a cyber attack or there's data leakage. So it's quite significant. And personally, I think COVID had a lot to do with that. A lot of people, including the cyber criminals, were working from home, maybe got bored, and yeah, realized it's quite a lucrative business. So this, especially the ransomware, it emphasizes the need to have backup and recovery systems in place. And one of the things that, and I can maybe just talk about some of the experience that we had at Transnet around the cyber attack, was that for one of the systems, the attackers actually went into they logged into the backup system, not only on the backup system, they deleted the backups, but actually went into a partition level and deleted the partitions. So they went that far to delete it. Fortunately for us, we had systems hardening in place, which we'll get to now, and that systems weren't encrypted. But had those systems been encrypted, yeah, the backup would have been lost as well. So what we did is we built it a immutable backup. And for those that don't know, immutable basically means that the backup can't be altered, deleted, overwritten in any way. So even if I give you the full admin rights, root, password, there's no ways that you can alter, delete, overwrite that backups. It's sitting on a separate SANS environment, and the only way to actually delete that is to physically go into the server room and log onto that console directly and format it if you need to. But yeah, remotely it's impossible. So that's one of the ways, one of the lessons learned, and one of the key things to make sure that you have immutable backups. The other one is around segmentation between IT and OT systems. And we've seen it a lot in my previous life as an auditor. A lot of companies don't segregate their IT and OT environments. So once an attacker is inside the IT environment, they can quickly hop over to the OT environment and they can create havoc there. Segmentation between these environments is quite critical. They could either be standalone environments completely, or it could be connected via a firewall to your IT network, and only certain traffic should be allowed between those two networks. This will also reduce the risks and exposure for your operational technology systems. And then lastly is the third lesson is around continuous security monitoring and incident response. So this is quite important, especially with the attacks these days that, and I showed somebody the other day, if I take any malware file and I open it and I just put a space or a comma, it changes the file hash name. It basically changes the signature of the malware, and that won't be detected by your old traditional anti-malware solutions. And that's why the new solutions that uses machine learning and uses the example, the MITRE attack framework to detect malware. And that's why it's important to monitor your systems, so that if there's, example, a zero-day attack or something that hasn't been detected before, that you can pick up there's some anomalies in your systems, and then you can respond adequately with a proper tested incident response plan. So we've discussed the different components in the maritime sector, the IT and the OT. We looked at some of the incidents, some of the things that went wrong, and now let's look at how we can then actually protect yourselves or the system. So there's a couple of risk mitigation strategies out there. The first one we're going to look at is just some of the cyber risk assessment framework and frameworks out there. So from the IT side, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. The NIST cybersecurity framework is well known for the IT side or ICT side. There's also the ISO 27001, COBIT 5, and a couple others for COBIT 2019. So those ones are all there to protect the ICT environment. But as mentioned, that it's also critical and important to protect your OT environment. The NIST SP 800, the SP stands for Special Publication 800-82, and the R is the third revision. That's also a framework specifically for industrial control systems or OT systems that gives a guide on how one would go about to perform risk assessments and how you would protect these systems. Then there's also the IEC 62443 that can be used to protect the OT environment. And it's quite key that these frameworks are adopted, because it will establish a robust guideline for identifying the vulnerabilities in your environment. It will help the organization assess their risks, and then also what controls you need to implement based on your risk assessment. These frameworks facilitate a standardized approach to evaluating cybersecurity measures and enhance the overall resistance of a company. One of the other things is the hardening of your IT and OT systems. If you enhance your security of your IT and OT systems, it will help protect your organization. One of the things is your network segmentation between your IT and OT. So there's a bit of a debate around whether you must keep your OT network completely segregated from your IT network, or whether you then connect it securely via a firewall. My take on it is that you want visibility. You can't protect what you don't know. So you want to have some sort of visibility in your OT networks. And that's why it's important then to segment it via a firewall, next generation firewall. And you only allow your example, your SOC, your security operations center, or your SIM tools in there, so that you can actually see what is happening inside that environment, so that you can actually pick up any anomalies. You can pick up any scans, any footprinting that somebody's done, so that you can detect before it's too late. One of the other critical things is multi-factor authentication. So multi-factor authentication, I don't think now it's something that should even be debated. If you don't have multi-factor authentication already, then it's almost too late. Even now with MFA, there's already a lot of attacks happening where people are trying to bypass MFA. There is a couple of techniques that people use to bypass it. MFA fatigue is one of them. The other day as well, a family member received a call from one of the fraud divisions of a bank, and our home language is Afrikaans, so the family member is Afrikaans, and this lady spoke fluent Afrikaans to them and saying this is a story. They're going to send them a PIN. They must just repeat the PIN for them so that they can actually verify it's their bank account. But luckily the family member has been made aware of the cyber risks because of myself being in the industry, and they could tell them to go fly a kite in a nice way. So basically MFA is trying to be bypassed, so it's one of the minimum requirements. There's other ways that MFA can now be slightly more strengthened. So example, something like a passwordless authentication. If you've got an example of authenticator app that can actually use your biometrics on your phone to authenticate you. So things like that needs to be done at minimum. Then you also need to look at some layered defenses. We always speak about defense in depth and defense in breadth. Making sure that if one layer of your defense is compromised, you've got another layer to protect. Your patching for IT and OT, that's quite critical. Your OT patching is also something that's quite tricky, because not everyone's got a test environment for the OT devices. Sometimes you're not going to find another example, a mooring system just to test on, because those things are expensive, or there's a second crane that you can just use for patching now. So you sometimes have to do patching in the live environment, which makes it tricky. But you have to rely on your OEM certified patches and so on. And then vulnerability management, both IT and OT, is also quite critical. Your vulnerability scanning in the OTs also needs to be done very slow and non-intrusive. Otherwise, you could disrupt some of the signals, and you can actually disrupt some of the systems. So that's just some of the hardening. There's also configuration hardening.
Barend, sorry, I'm just going to give you a shout out. There are about 4 minutes till the Q&A session.
Perfect. Okay, almost there. Okay, and then incident response and business continuity, BCM, business continuity, as mentioned, that this is quite important of monitoring your environment, making sure that you've got proper playbooks in place. So for those that's familiar with your SIM, you might have automated playbooks in place to say, example, if this type of malware is detected, or immediately block it, this is the steps it needs to take. There's also the security orchestration, automation, and response, or SOAR, that can be implemented. But it's quite important that you have incident response with your monitoring, as well as business continuity. This is very difficult sometimes to implement a business continuity, especially if it's a manual operating. So example, the Port of Durban, when we had the ransomware attack, it couldn't be operated manually because there's a couple thousand containers that goes through there in an hour. So in 2-3 hours, it's going to be quite difficult to capture all those container or moves. And then also in terms of your RTOs, your recovery time objectives, and your recovery time, you need to make sure that, example, you don't want to go back too much. You almost want a live or a synchronized environment for your backups. Your supply chain security is quite critical. This is where you need to vet your third parties. As mentioned, that there's quite a lot of intricacies and dependencies in this supply chain of the sector. So third-party vulnerabilities is quite critical. Things like your SOC 2, Type 2 reports, audit reports, your ISO 27001 compliant certifications can be requested from your vendors and suppliers, making sure that they are compliant. And then obviously cybersecurity awareness. Not going to touch much on this. We all know about what's the importance of cybersecurity awareness, but maybe just one thing, your crew and non-computer users, they also need to be covered, and they need to be covered in depth as well. It's no point of training the computer users and non-computer users find a USB memory stick and then they plug it into the system and you get compromised. Control implementation phases starts from your foundation, basic, intermediate, advanced, up to your mature phase. And each of these phases, just quickly going to touch, this is one of the roadmaps that I developed as part of my studies. But it all starts with your current state assessment. You need to do a proper risk assessment. You need to identify all the threat actors, all the different threats in your organization. And then you can start to look at what's your current state. And then from there, you need to do stakeholder engagement. Then you can develop your strategy, frameworks, roles, responsibilities, and so on. Then you can move to stage 2, where you do basically your processes, your policies, etc. So this processes basically talks about processes, people, and technology, implementing the technology, education. You expand your risk assessment. Stage 4 is where you do advanced integration, your culture integration, your board engagement, and stage 5, your predictive analytics, AI, and so continuous monitoring. Then lastly, on future trends and emerging threats, AI, we know has a potential for revolutionizing the cybersecurity industry. And then AI is already being used for threat detection and automated monitoring and responses, as mentioned with the SOAR and your different playbooks. Just maybe touching on the last thing is around quantum computing. It poses a new challenge that soon traditional encryption methods might be cracked within seconds, and it might be necessary for us to develop post-quantum cryptography standards to ensure ongoing data protection. And we've come to the end. And yeah, questions.
Hi, Barend. Thank you. So thank you for an excellent presentation. lots to think about there for the students. We've got quite a lot of questions. So to the students who are asking questions, please don't ask 2 or 3 questions on your turn. Ask 1 question. Barend, if you can try and, try and get through the answers succinctly so we can try to get a couple of students through. Shungu, Masawi, you can go. I've enabled your mic. You just need to unmute, please. Shungu? Okay, I'm moving on. Sabal Balwe Dinyati. You can go.
Okay. My question is that how do cybersecurity risks from a third-party vendors, like software providers, impact maritime operations?
From software providers. Yeah, so basically, if you've got third parties, software providers, there might be vulnerabilities in that software. And one of the vulnerabilities I mentioned is example 0-day. That's basically a vulnerability that nobody knows about. It might be a vulnerability that the software provider doesn't even know about. So that's how it could be impacted. You might be using that software and it could expose your organization to vulnerabilities. And that's why it's important to monitor any anomalies in your environment. I hope I answered that.
Thank you, Barend. Next question is from Akidan Kihinde. Akidan, you can just unmute your mic.
Yeah, good afternoon. My question is that basically I have 2 questions. One is, how do maritime cybersecurity risks differ from those in other industries? How do maritime cybersecurity risk differ from those in other like in other industries? And the number 2 question is, what cybersecurity measures should be in place for IoT devices on ships? Thank you.
Thanks. So the risks differ, as mentioned, that the complexity of the environment, the critical dependencies with different other role players. Your attack surface is much more bigger. You don't have, it's not only IT you've got to consider, you've also got to consider OT, IoT devices, industrial Internet of Things, different communication protocols. So your risk assessment needs to be thorough and take into account all the different attack surfaces, but also looking at all your different threat actors. And your threat actors is basically those people that want to attack, and you need to understand why they want to attack it. Because it's, like I mentioned, it's lucrative. You might have state-sponsored attackers as well, which will be quite a difficult thing to defend against, but you need to look at all those different threat actors and the attack surfaces. So that will basically increases your risk and complexity thereof. To protect IoT devices, yeah, there's quite a lot you can do. My PhD was actually on industrial Internet of Things. So basically, the steps that I mentioned, you need to start with a risk assessment, looking at what is the device used for. Sometimes we say you need to maybe look what data is the device using and protect the data. So example, if you've got an IoT device that's monitoring, let's say, temperature in a reefer that contains food, you want that to be 100% accurate. So you don't want somebody to mess with that. So obviously you'll need to get more controls in place, like access controls, encryption, etc., etc. But if you've got an IoT device that basically just measures the speed of a truck, it's not as critical as that temperature one. So that's where your risk assessment, you need to expand it and see what is the different uses for that device so that you can protect it based on that risk. Thanks.
Thank you, Barend. John Mabunda, you can unmute yourself. Hi, John, I can't hear you. I can see you are unmuted, but I can't hear your question. Will you just test your mic and we'll try and come back to you, please. Tuso Makhatle, I'm just allowing your mic. You can unmute. Go.
Okay, good day, everyone, and a nice presentation today. My question today is, Stuxnet is considered the first cyber weapon designed to manipulate OTs, where malicious actors gained access to exploit PLCs, resulting to critical infrastructure damage. So, is this type of an attack, was it state-owned, and what measures were taken to the perpetrators to minimize the risk of these kind of cyber attacks from occurring in the future? That's only my question. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so there is rumors, and it hasn't been confirmed, but that it was sponsored by state-owned hackers. I won't mention the country, but yeah, it was state-sponsored attack. It was, like you said, it was one of the first big attacks that basically set off the need for OT, industrial control systems protections. It actually stole not only one but 4 valid certificates to do the attack. So one of the ways that you need to protect is you need to look at holistically at the environment. So if you look at the NIST, that special publication 800 that I mentioned, there's different ways of making sure that your OT environment is protected. Back in the days, you could just leave it segregated, like I said, air-gapped. But now there's new variants of Stuxnet called Havocs and so on that actually can, if you plug in that USB into your OT net or industrial control network, it will scan information. And then once you plug it back into your IT network, it will feed it back to the attackers, giving you that information. They can then write the script and based on the vulnerabilities they found, and then inject it back once somebody plugged that USB back into the OT side. So basically breaching the air gaps. So it's quite important to look at all the different attack vectors. And as mentioned, look at that standard. That's quite a long standard to help you protect yourself. But that's the only way to do a defense in depth approach to the attacks. Thanks.
Thank you, Barend. We're unfortunately out of time, and I do want to first thank you before you go. This was an excellent lecture, and what makes it really cool, I think, is that last week we had one from the Civil Aviation Authority on aviation cybersecurity. So to complement that with maritime cybersecurity is just wonderful. Obviously, if you're coming from Transnet, then there's the whole issue as well of other infrastructure, rail infrastructure, and of course, fuel pipelines and all sorts of things. I don't think people often stop to think about what a complex and massive organization Transnet is. So I think on behalf of the students, if I can thank you, but also on behalf of the students, to you and the team at Transnet who keep the entire supply chain in South Africa moving. And the ports that service not only South Africa, but our neighbors as well. It's a huge, massive undertaking, and it's great to hear from you. Get a peek behind the door, if I can put it that way. And yeah, just truly a wonderful lecture. So thank you, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Cheers, Barend.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.